Upper and middle-class Victorians frequently attended balls and parties, but after a while doing the same dances and talking to the same people over and over again could get pretty boring. Their solution to spicing things up? Buying a mummy and unwrapping it. Welcome to the third episode of Fun Facts about Victorian Death and Mourning. I am your host, the Gentle Fae, a PhD student specialising in Victorian death culture. And in this series, I'm sharing some of the dark and macabre things I've learned along the way. In today's episode, we are delving into the incredibly inappropriate and disrespectful, but fascinating world of mummy unwrapping parties. Following Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt in 1796, there followed a bit of an Egyptian craze within the Western world. The West became fascinated with the customs of the ancient Egyptians, and in particular with mummies and the process of mummification. Before long, travellers began to buy mummies that had been stolen out of graves and bringing them back home so they could be publicly unwrapped. These public gatherings were initially geared to archaeologists, surgeons, and those with a more scientific interest, though anyone who could afford a ticket could attend. Those who did not wish to damage the mummy during the unwrapping would hire professional mummy unwrappers, like Johann Blumenbach and the famous Thomas Pettigrew. The events were so popular that they were sometimes even reported on by local newspapers. Perhaps one of the most popular of these events was the unwrapping of the mummy of Horsesy by Pettigrew at the Royal College of Surgeons in 1834. The mummy was part of the collection of the Hunterian Museum at the college. The number of people who wished to attend the event was so considerable that they had to turn people away from the door after ensuring them that they would be able to view the unenrolled mummy at a later date. Pettigrew's unwrappings all followed a similar script. The mummy would be laid out on a table surrounded by Egyptian funerary images, objects, and hieroglyphic texts. Pettigrew would then give a lecture about how the Egyptians preserved their dead, and would unveil the name and, if known, the rank of the deceased. Then the unwrapping would ensue. Part of the wrapping and some of the artifacts encountered during the unwrapping would be passed around for the audience to examine. When fully unwrapped, Pettigrew would then proceed to dissect the mummy, apparently narrating the entire event in painstaking detail. Just in case the unwrapping did not go according to plan due to the adhesive being too strong, or as a result of the mummy simply disintegrating upon being unwrapped, Pettigrew had an already unwrapped specimen on hand, so no one would have to be disappointed and the dissection could continue according to plan. Seeing the popularity of these mummy unwrapping events, the well-to-do decided to start hosting their own versions. During these events, the people gathered to watch either a professional or lay person unwrap the mummy in a way that mimicked the public unwrappings. In the process, they would discover several potentially valuable artifacts, such as scarabs or amulets, in the wrappings or in the sarcophagus. Those who attended were occasionally gifted these artifacts or a piece of the wrapping itself as a souvenir to remember the evening by. In this, these private events mimicked the public events as well, where people were often able to purchase the antiquities or were gifted a somewhat more morbid souvenir. Pettigrew apparently blessed one of his spectators with the hand of one of the mummies he unwrapped. Such a charming keepsake. However, unlike those with a more scientific interest, more well-to-do had no interest in learning about human anatomy, and therefore had little use for the mummy after the unwrapping was over. As such, they frequently just tossed away the remains as ordinary rubbish, believing that it held no value. Please note that while there are some wild stories out there on the web that claim that attendees of the mummy unwrapping parties would also eat the flesh of the mummy immediately for health purposes, there is no actual evidence for this. This is not to say that they were not used for medication. As far back as the 12th century, people would grind down parts of mummies in order to turn them into medication and balms. But it is unclear how popular this type of medication still was in the Victorian era. Where prior to the mummy mania of the 19th century, mummies were still perceived as prized specimens that were to be carefully preserved, they increasingly became disposable curiosities over the course of the century. It is not entirely clear why mummy unwrapping parties lost their popularity during the early 20th century. Perhaps some people came to the realization how incredibly inappropriate grave robbery and desecration were. But with that note, I will leave you, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed my exploration of the bizarre practice of mummy unwrapping parties, and that you agree with me that, unlike the Victorians, we should leave the mummies well alone and in their original place and state. In the next episode, we are staying within the realm of grave robbers when we talk about resurrection men. Men who stole recently interred British bodies to sell them to anatomical schools for dissection. Do we see a pattern here? Absolutely. Till next time, and remember, stay comfy and spooky, my friends.